Cara is American, you see. So you've
Yes, okay.
Yes, this is the exclusive time that I will be happy to speak for my country. At the moment, as an American, you don't want to do that, but but congratulations. That's really, really cool.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So looking forward to getting stuck into it.
Hi, Cara.
Hi, Vicky.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm very excited today because I get to speak to you most weeks, which is wonderful. Okay. But today...
So play that down. Come on.
That's true. Sorry. But today we have the wonderful Luke Pepera with us. We've got our first guest on the She
Yay!
Oh, I might. Oh gosh! Wow!
Yeah, officially.
Thank you. No. Honestly, it's a privilege. Brilliant to be here.
No, thank you for being here. And we're going to chat about all things African history today. What have we done? We've kind of skirted on African history a little bit, but we can't wait to dive in. So I've got a little introduction for us, if that's okay. We are incredibly excited to welcome Luke Pepera, Ghanaian-born, Oxford-educated historian. Luke is truly revolutionising how we engage with African history as an insightful author of Motherland, moving us beyond common narratives to uncover the incredibly rich and diverse and often surprising stories of the continent's past. Prepare to have your perspective broadened and your understanding enriched. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you. Really kind introduction.
Thank you. So we actually crossed paths, didn't we? The way our paths crossed each other was at Gloucester History Festival, which I think Cara was the main source of Gloucester History Festival for me. I think you introduced me to it, Cara.
I've wanted to go for a few years. This is the first year I've actually made it. And Luke, your talk was the standout thing that I thought this is the thing we're going to plan our day around. So we were so excited to hear you and to learn some more.
Yeah, thank you. No, yes, exactly. It was Gloucester, and it was a real pleasure to meet you guys. And then you also had some really lovely photos as well, which I asked if I could like repost because they were really nice. And organized for me to come onto your onto your amazing podcast. Focusing on women in history, and that is that's a topic that definitely fits very neatly into African history and African culture as well, because it's full of first extraordinary female figures, but actually there's a particular historical and cultural attitude in many African societies towards women, which people who are a little bit more familiar with, let's say, Western history might not know about, and might be something that's quite novel.
Nice. Did you get any other photos? Was it just my dodgy Instagram?
No,
the nice.
So I got. I think I don't know. I mean, I think maybe there was one other person who took like some of me on stage. So I got some really nice photos of people kind of afterwards and around, but on stage itself, they were kind of few and far between, and I didn't really have the foresight to kind of hand someone my phone and be all like,
I would have tried a lot harder if I knew.
No, it was honestly, it was great.
We were spellbound. Nobody was whipping their phone out. You should take that as a massive compliment.
It was. I do take that as a huge compliment, honestly, and it's so kind of you to say that you enjoyed talk so much, and that was the one that you were kind of looking forward to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really well attended, I thought, as well. There was a lot of people there.
Yes, and there was, So, no nerves at all talking to that a house that was slightly fuller than I had kind of envisaged. But as kind of a debut, and it's funny actually because I'm sort of still working out how to do kind of talks. I would say that I'm probably better naturally in conversation, and when I can kind of bounce off an interviewer and what the interviewer is saying and the points they pick up on, and it really helps spark like fresh insights for me. And this was one of the few talks, I think potentially even the first one, where I was actually just was on my own notes presenting to an audience, and I'd actually kind of written something, and it was half scripted, half bullet points, because I couldn't really decide what to do. I think sometimes if it's too scripted, you're not engaging with the audience enough. But the trouble with having something that's too bullet pointed is that you can kind of you can sway away from your main points. So actually I did something in between, and there was a script, actually a bit of a script that I wanted to follow, and about halfway through I realized that something I planned to say later I'd already said, so that kind of like threw me off like a little bit. But I was just like, I was kind of in the flow anyway, and I know I kind of break it down into stories, and I know which stories people are interested in and kind of like as well, and that are kind of they're interesting in of itself, but they're also crowd pleasers. So
I think you're giving Cara a heart attack. We approach our podcast very differently, and Cara is a script lady, aren't you?
Yes, I don't want to engage with human beings. I just want to read from a page and then go about my business. Vicky's approach is so much similar to yours, though. The little blocks of main points, couple of bullets, and interestingly, from the outside, because we're in the audience here on the stage and having that experience, I had no idea. I had no idea that things had gone a little.
Well, I should have kept it a secret, man. There we go. Yeah. No, things, and I think I realized that was maybe actually just the natural flow, and the way I was doing it in the script was probably not as natural. So actually, when I went with that, I said, actually, this feels natural, so then we go with that, which is why hopefully it didn't come across as too. But then that means you guys complement each other, because then you kind of all have advocates the sort of bullet points, and it's a little more flow a little bit more loosely, and then Cara's the script. It's actually a great balance to have. So yeah, definitely. But but
we cover all bases, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But it was fun being there and getting to talk to about African history to such an engaged audience with awesome members like yourself, and then to meet people afterwards. So,
well, tell us more about for the listeners, your background, how you got into this African history, because this is your career now, this is your job. So how on earth did that happen? Because it's very exciting.
Yes. So I was born in Ghana and raised in Ghana. Before coming to school at the UK at an early age, and then all the way up to university. And I'd always been interested in sort of history, mythology, culture, and also storytelling more generally. I'd say writing, but storytelling more. And initially, that was through the Greek myths and Roman myths and legends is what I'd grown attracted to. And as I was ending sort of my time at school and working out what I wanted to do, especially for university, etc. But it was actually at the end of the school we had to do like a personal project, which counted towards our final grades. But the subject, we were quite open in what we could do it about. And I decided to do mine about an element of Ghanaian African history. Actually, no one really has explored any African history. So as you're going, you could have scope to do that. So I thought, actually, that I don't even know a lot about that history in particular, but then also the history of my a lot of my own heritage, the deeper history of the ethnic groups, like the Ghanaian ethnic group, the Ashanti or the Kweu, who kind of form my background and my heritage. So I decided actually that that might be quite interesting to explore. So I actually wanted to do a project on the history of the Kweu, one of the ethnic groups that I belong to in Ghana. And my first point of call was the National Museum of Ghana, where I thought I'd find some more general information. And when I went, I found that there wasn't really much there apart from information and artifacts relating to transatlantic slavery and colonialism. But I knew that there was a lot more to African history than this, because I just sort of encountered it, always going back or traveling back to Ghana. You see a lot of the culture around you, the sort of masks and drums and songs and stories. It's kind of all there. So that there was, there is a deeper past, there is a deeper culture, but it wasn't really being brought out in any conscious or intellectual way. And the museum was kind of representative of that. But there was actually an element where it sort of was, and that was at the university. So my second point of call is that I managed to get in touch with a couple of professors at the University of Ghana, and one of them, for instance, showed me this museum at the back of the archaeology department, which housed Ghanaian artifacts dating to 500 AD, and they were ironworking artifacts, so used to make iron implements, and also the instruments or the implements themselves. And that, all the information that I got from these professors and some of the resources they recommended me, etc., allowed me to kind of complete my to complete my project. But I'd kind of become I kind of got an introduction to to that history and to that archaeology, and that was just for one group of people or even in just one country. So I was excited, I was keen to know if what else lay beyond even just Ghana. I mean, more in Ghana, but then I knew that I'd be able to discover more in Ghana, but also what lay beyond that too. So that prompted me then, because this was end of school year, so that prompted me then to want to study, it was end of my school time, so that prompted me to want to study archaeology and anthropology at university, because I thought that would be one way to interrogate this past. And there I did a module on the formation of sub-Saharan African states, existed between the 11th and 15th centuries in Zimbabwe, and they built this massive stone city of concentric circles and were trading, had trade links with the Indians and the Chinese, and then also the East Africans on the Swahili coast, and the empires of Ghana, Songhai, and Mali between the 9th and 16th, 17th centuries, and their trade across the Sahara and the Mediterranean. There was just so much information there to dig my teeth into. After I graduated, there was sort of this Venn diagram existing sort of in my mind of Africa, history, and storytelling, all kind of, sort of. I wanted to do something at the confluence of that, that connected these things together. When I left university, I started writing, but actually I was writing sort of fiction stories initially. So that was kind of the storytelling side, but that were allowing me to kind of develop my creativity. And then that kind of transitioned into doing some about, doing some stories, including sort of a young adult novel, which was a novelization of this Ghanaian myth. So that was kind of where the Africa writing storytelling came into being. And then
so creative.
Yeah, well, I was just trying. At the time, I was just trying different things, but then that later on developed into a blog about African history and culture. So those were kind of non-fiction pieces. It was just think pieces about different elements of African history and culture that came to mind. And actually, a lot of those blog pieces formed the foundation of the chapters in Motherland. I later realized. I went back and looked at some of them not too long ago. So I did a blog piece on the veneration of ancestors, and then that kind of formed that's a chapter I do in Motherland. So I was doing this blog, maintaining it and trying to kind of engage people, find a way to kind of break into, like I said, telling stories about Africa. It wasn't actually getting much traction, to be perfectly honest. During lockdown, and it was 2020, and it was also just after the George Floyd, the George Floyd incident and all the protests, etc. Kate Williams had basically posted on Twitter saying, anyone of African descent who's interested in getting into history, being a historian, should message me. And I was familiar with her and familiar with her work. I watched her on TV in particular. So I just got in touch with her, basically asking for advice. I said, I've written this blog. Her advice was that if when I wrote to her, she said, your stuff on the blog is interesting. It's pretty interesting. If you want to do TV, the best thing to do initially would be to do a book. And then you can go from there, basically. And
so this is just one piece. Motherland is one piece of this.
Motherland was exact. Well, it was just, how do I put it? I think it's, I've tried to kind of tell the story in as broad strokes as I can, so that it's not too, it doesn't become too boring or over detailed. I say sometimes to people that Motherland, as well, the non-fiction history, is one of the last things I kind of I'd kind of come to, because I'd tried everything else. I'd even done a so just before I was in touch with Kate Williams, and just after I tried with the novels and I'd done short stories, the novels and the blogs, I'd done this part-time filmmaking course in the Met Film School in Ealing, and it was basically it was a part-time course, and at the end of it you basically made like a short film. And again, that film explored elements of African culture and heritage, including the Africa or Ghanaian folklore hero Anansi, who's sort of our god of mythology and storytelling, and he was also the main character of the novel. So again, that was at the confluence of writing Africa and storytelling, all these things that had kind of existed in me for a little bit, and was just trying to get a structure and find out how to really just how to make it work in reality, as it were. After I got in touch with Kate and showed her my stuff, and she gave me that advice, then she was the one who kind of introduced me to the people who could actually make my plans or my dreams and my ambitions a reality. So, for instance, she introduced me to to an agent, and it was with them I worked on the proposal for what is now Motherland, basically.
Wow.
So we had discussions to flesh out the idea, and then that was what an editor was kind of interested
All
in.
from a tweet. All from a tweet, isn't it?
All from a tweet, yeah, all from a tweet. But I think, also want to say is that, yes, from the Twitter, but, again, I got in touch with so many people, like Fred. I tried to anyone who I'd met, friends, I'll say, if you're anybody in sort of documentaries or in films, I mean, even in between as well, I'd done some tutoring just to kind of, keep active. But then I get in touch with, like I said, producers, people who worked in journalism, academics, just trying to find,
creative industries are so hard to navigate, aren't they? They're so difficult to find your place and what's keeping authentic as well.
Yes, exactly.
What you want to say and what you want to do.
Exactly. And I think it's, it's basically because you're left for the most part to kind of work it out for yourself. There's no structure so much, there's no graduate scheme, as it were, on becoming a popular star. But it's just, I think, really important just to I think having a body of material, like I at least what worked for me was having a body of material, i.e. the blog, and then just trying to get in touch with as many people as possible.
This started as a blog. This podcast was a blog. Like, it's had many iterations, I guess. Actually, some of the episodes are pulled directly from the blog, much like you did, because, I know the stories are exciting. I know that they've got the wow factors and the moments that make people remember the stories. And, and it saves time, doesn't it? I've done all this research already.
As well, what I'm noticing about both of you is that you have a real clarity about what you're interested in and wanting to share that. And you can afford then to be flexible about the how. Like, you're going to attack it. You're going to try every way that you can, because what you're really interested in is that story and sharing it. How it gets to people, that's fine. Whatever works. That's really practical and very cool to just, keep trying.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I think industries move on a little bit, don't they? Because, well, I say that books stood the test of time, haven't they? Because there was that period where it was like, was it ebooks or Kindles were like outdoing like paper books, and now it seems to have flipped back the other way. But like podcasting is still quite in its infancy, I think, isn't it? And
podcasting and audio for sure, and I think audiobooks as well. Will become probably the next thing that people kind of engage with and enjoy. And kind of what with Cara said is that if you have if you know what you want to share and you just have a passion for sharing something, I think you just do that in whatever format, and then you find the one that kind of works for you. I think I've tried probably, and often I will do something just to try it. For the most part, if the opportunity kind of presents itself, and working out if it kind of fits for me, because I think the thing that you're more likely, you're more likely to succeed at is the thing you're more likely to do more of, and the thing you're more likely to do more of is the thing that you enjoy. So I really like writing and books, for example, but as Cara said, it's all to do with just sharing. Sharing, for me, it's about sharing stories and knowledge and information about the deeper African past, African history, and culture. That's kind of the foundation.
I loved you mentioning Anansi, because we had a librarian when I was a very young girl who brought those stories to us, and that was like the best part of school. She would sit us all down and read these tales, and your enjoyment and love of it just comes through. I wonder, this being She Changed History, I won't kind of crack on about Anansi for too awful long, but I wonder if there are other figures from folklore who sort of resonated with you in that way, and bonus points if they are female.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the female, because actually in the American South, Anansi himself was transformed into a female figure, Auntie Nancy. So he actually kind of he becomes, because what he is in Ghana and actually in Jamaica and then obviously in the American South is that even in these societies that obviously are kind of culturally, historically related, but have had, the people who live within them have obviously had different experiences. And the Africans, and especially the Akan, that the larger group of people who lived in the regional territory of what's now Ghana, and who were one of the primary groups who were sort of enslaved and trafficked to the Caribbean and then also to the American South. But in all of them, Anansi functions as a figure of freedom, actually. So in a traditional Akan society in West Africa, it's a society that's seen as being quite restrictive and quite hierarchical. It's quite like rule-based. And, you know, there are different kinds of conduct and behavior and respect that you have to accord to different people. And in the stories, Anansi is this chaotic figure who breaks all the rules and does what he wants. And part of the reason for that is actually provides almost a catharsis for people who feel frustrated with having to follow all the rules in society. So that's one of the reasons to tell the story. And then in Jamaica, he acted as this disruptive figure. And so he's like even in a can, he's the underdog, but in Jamaica, he's kind of this underdog figure who is outsmarting all these figures who are much more powerful than him, and through that gaining his freedom, which is what the enslaved Akan in Jamaica were inspired to do, you know, with their masters. So he was basically a figure of rebellion. He was this figure of rebellion and resilience in difficult times. And it was kind of a similar thing in the American South. And also, like I said, he transforms become female because he takes on a much more, maybe I would say, like arguably traditionally maternal aspect and instinct, and he's about looking out for his people and making sure that they're comfortable. And you know, again, there's that influence and importance of the female figure in African American culture, as you know, the mother's a figure, and so seen as foundational support in the community. And I think that has something to do with Anansi's transition. I mean, in Ghana as well, there's a figure. I mean, she's sort of the opposite. It's quite funny, but there's a folklore figure called Mami Wata, who I think has also made. I don't know. She's not as international. I mean, Anansi is quite extraordinary because he has this international. I mean, like you mentioned, people telling stories about him when you were young. I mean, he's achieved this kind of international and even to an extent pop culture recognition. You know, he exists in novels, he's in Neil Gaiman novels, and he's in comic books, and he's in loads of different media. I don't think Mami Wata, the same figure, has kind of had, but she's basically almost like a water spirit who tempts misbehaving men to their doom, essentially. So she's the complete opposite, if I remember correctly.
We love a dangerous woman. That's
Exactly.
right.
It's kind of the men who are kind of they're adulterers or like wife beaters, that kind of thing. She's almost like that figure of like retribution towards them. And that's kind of the influence and position she holds in traditional Akan society, and this quite like a feared but also a spiritual figure, and also she's connected with this powerful but also pure spiritual force, which is water. Obviously, you know, she's said to reside in water formations, and knows these people who are prone to misbehaving, but and also mistreat a woman to a certain kind of doom. Yes, acts as that. So there's a sort of an anti-transition, and then there's this one figure who's also quite well known in the Akan context.
Isn't it interesting that there's probably so many things like that in our society that have African heritage and have sourced from Africa, that you wouldn't necessarily, because there's something, isn't rap from Ghanaian culture as well?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very well guys specifically, but I think rap, and then especially rap battles in the United States share a lot of elements and features that can be traced back to Africa. Oral storytelling, the oral form, word games, riddling games, just oral literature is so incredibly developed in Africa. I mean, we as a species generally, you know, human beings, sort of storytelling and oral storytelling is important, but in Africa that tradition has been maintained. So in so many African cultures, you have hereditary storytellers, whether it's the Ochiami in Ghana or the griots just above Ghana, sort of what's described as the Sahel, which is the western part of Sudan. Hereditary storytellers, and it's just they're a group of people, a caste in society whose job it is to remember or record, remember, and pass down the history. And so, African cultures, especially just orally, lyrically, are very well practiced, and a lot of that, for lack of a better word, talent, but a lot of that history and a lot of that heritage found its way, obviously, to to the United States via the Africans who existed in that society early on. And I do want to stress that rap is very much an African American form. Like it's not. I think it has. One could argue definitely for its roots being in Africa, and I do think could put evidence forward for its roots being there, but it couldn't have, as it is now, as rap is now, and as it developed, it couldn't have developed probably anywhere else than in that context of America and of the Africans in America too.
Yeah. I was thinking how oral traditions, they must bring such a sense of belonging, because you referenced it there as a role. It was a role for people to do, and gosh, that is that's a very important job. It's,
Yes, and and exactly. I mean, this even ties into the entire African conception of history itself. Is that what is recorded and remembered is what's important for ensuring, maintaining, and ensuring social and cultural cohesion. It's about getting people to understand who they are, why they are, and why it's important that they understand who they are and why they are. And that's all to do with fostering. So you would notice a lot of the traditional, in the narratives of a lot of the traditional storytellers, the people whose job it is to record. And, and in, I mentioned those West African storytellers, the griots in the Sahel and in Niger and Mali, etc. What's interesting with them particularly is that, that role was not a role that was restricted to men. You had female griots as well, but then they were actually, the griots generally, both men and women, were more than just storytellers or historians. They also performed other roles in society. So, for example, in certain cultures in that part of Africa, the female griots would help to, for example, attend a bride during her wedding day, for instance, as well as recording the history. There was actually complete equality between male and female griots, and actually even in Senegal in the 20th century, there were these, and I mentioned them briefly actually in my book, Motherland, but there's a group of women called Diriyanke, which means like women living in opulence and elegance. And they're essentially wealthy. They're essentially wealthy, they're independently wealthy, well-respected women, and they sort of travel around. They're usually like, they're usually involved in some kind of business or commerce, and they travel around with these massive entourages, including female griots. And one of their jobs, and this is a job for all griots, but in this particular context, or this is a job all griots do, but in this particular context, the female griots who travel with them, and they're kind of patronized by them. So the Diriyanke, the rich women will kind of pay them for these services. But one of the things they do is they go around singing what's called praise songs in honor of these women, saying, you're so wonderful and you're so right, and your ancestors, are phenomenal, and it all goes to raising the woman's prestige, such that when she is in, let's say, a group with potential contacts or business contacts, she's seen as being a person with whom they would certainly want to do business.
Nice.
So
yes, please. That sounds great. So I could listen to you talk all day. It's ridiculous. Do you have any women from either the research in your book or from your vast amount of knowledge in African history that we think people should know about more?
Yes, certainly. Off the top of my head, I kind of have two or three who kind of really impressed me. One is top three. One is the 17th century queen of the kingdom of Ndongo. Ndongo existed in what's now northern Angola, and her name is Injinga Mbande. And she's particularly phenomenal because she was the first queen of her kingdom. The first queen of Ndongo. In Ndongo, women had always been important and respected. They'd always taken part in affairs, political affairs, and economic affairs and current affairs. They had always been relatively independent in the sense that they didn't need to marry, for example, to ensure that they could live or they were looked after. They could divorce for whatever reason they wished. They weren't viewed as property in any way. But there had not yet been, by the 17th century, the female king, whose people sort of remembered. Maybe in Ndongo's distant past, there had been female founders. So Injinga is the first, but she is well remembered in Angola to date, basically for almost single-handedly ensuring the maintenance of the sovereignty of her kingdom in the face of increasing Portuguese expansion, especially in West Central Africa. So, like I said, active in sort of from the late 16th to the mid 17th century, and she fights against the Portuguese for about for close to 50 years, but she's often on the battlefield herself, directly engaged in the conflict against them. So she's absolutely phenomenal.
I find this with a lot of our women, don't we, Cara? They're always on the battlefield. They're always
hands-on. Yep.
Yeah, they're so hands-on.
Not afraid to get hands-on.
Yeah.
Yes. That's why she just perfectly fits the description of a warrior queen. And I find that a lot of these figures, historical female figures, were exactly that. They were queens in the sense that they were the highest authority in their kingdom, and they governed their kingdom, and they did all the kind of more, the day-to-day running of the kingdom, as it were, the day-to-day governance. But they revolved in all aspects, including warfare. And when there were in the midst of the fray, often a lot more than some kings were in most instances, actually. So I'd say Injinga Mbande the second, and these are, Injinga I write about in Motherland. The second is Amanirenas, about whom we don't know. Her name is Amanirenas, about whom we don't have as much information, but she lived around the turn of the millennium, so say, around 20 BC to around 1080, so around that time, in Nubia, which is essentially what's now northern Sudan and southern Egypt. And she was one of a group of female figures that are collectively called by collectively known as the Kandankes by scholars. And these were basically queen mothers in Kush who at one point in time ruled the kingdom independently. So in Kush, Kush is just another word for.
We did an episode on.
There you go. So then your listeners will
so we know a little bit,
and then your listeners will already be familiar. So the Nubia was sort of the country in the location that I described, northern Sudan, southern Egypt, and in that country, the Nubians had three kingdoms. So there was Kama, which existed from it's as old as 5000 BC.
It's crazy, isn't it? The time frames.
5000 BC to I think to around 1500 BC, correct? And then there was Napata, which was around 800 BC to around 300 BC. And then there was, because it's sort of the in-between part is when the Egyptians sort of invaded and conquered Nubia, basically. And then, Napata, 800 BC to 300 BC, and then Meroe, which was about 300 BC to about 350 AD. During the Napatan period, so from about 800 BC to 300 BC, and since Kama, women had always been important, but in Kama, they had more like religious roles, socio-religious roles. So they were important priestesses, the administration, and they performed rituals that helped deepen the king's relationship with the gods, essentially. And then in 800 BC, their importance increased, so that the founder of the Napatan dynasty, a Nubian king called Lara, basically made it so that Kushite kingship became elective. So before that, it was probably, for the most part, primogeniture. So at least one of the sons of the former king would inherit. But Lara made it so that there would be an election held between the sons of also his sons, but then also the sons of his sisters as well. So his nephews, and the generals and the important officials in Kush would basically converse and argue amongst themselves as to who should be the best leader, and they would elect them. And what happened is that when the king was elected, then their mother took on the position of the queen mother, and the queen mother was arguably the most important position in Kush. She had a really important role in deciding who the next electee would be. So the queen mother of the king who just died basically would have an important role in deciding who the next electee would be amongst that dead king's children or his nephews, etc. Mm-hmm. And then when the electee was chosen, that person's mother would become the new queen mother. And when the king would so change. So before the electee could be officially confirmed as the new king of Kush, he would have to travel around all the important cities in Nubia, and at each temple in the cities, he would basically have to be confirmed in his role by the god Moon. And this took part, this happened as part of a special ceremony. But one of the really important parts of that ceremony is that his mother, the queen mother, would have to come and basically give a speech asking Amun to consecrate her son such that he could rule Nubia. And if that ritual that was done by the queen mother wasn't completed, then the king was not allowed to rule. So she was directly she was directly part of that process of making him the next queen. And part of the reason for that is that Egyptians and Nubians shared a lot of their religion, a lot of their cosmology with each other. But in Nubia, the goddess Isis was important, and obviously her son Horus was important. In the physical world, where the Nubians actually lived, they saw the queen mother as Isis, not even as a representative. They saw literally as Isis, and they saw the son literally as Horus. And as part of the stories, it is Isis, she kind of, she raises him to take over as king, and that was kind of being paralleled in the Nubian world was that the Queen Mother was raising her son to be an effective ruler. So in that case, she was phenomenally important. And this, I think this is important to mention because this is the foundation on which that queen I mentioned at the start, Amanirenas, and the Kandankes in general, those kind of female autocratic rulers of Kush came into being, is that it's important to realize that female importance and female power was baked into Nubian society. Mostly it's the queen mother and her son, but sometimes it's actually the wife, the king and the queen, the wife and husband. And this was the case with Amanirenas. She kind of rules. Her husband is called Tiritakas, and she rules quite, mostly alongside him. So, for instance, when the Romans invade and conquer Egypt, and they have this plan to conquer both Western Asia and Nubia at the same time. They want to conquer both. So what they do is they make incursions into northern Nubia, and then the northern Nubians rebel, Amutan, and then the Romans kind of come back at them. But actually, when the Nubians rebel, Tiritakas and Amanirenas support the rebellion. So they directly engage in the conflict against them. And then when the Romans kind of push back, Amanirenas actually takes over, and she's described by the Greek historian Strabo as being this kind of fearsome, one-eyed warrior queen. And it's this terrifying, it's almost like this kind of, the Amazon of legend. Yeah, and actually there are stelae in relief where the queen is represented as being bigger and larger and more powerful than, the Kandanki, than her husband, than the Nubian king. And she's often depicted with these traditional Egyptian motifs denoting power and conquest and control. So one of the favorite ones is sort of smiting enemies is like a very favorite motif of the Egyptians to show kind of dominance and power. And you see Kandankes who are presented in this way, but actually presenting themselves as both feminine and powerful in that African context. And there's no contradiction between the two. Amanirenas, she's well known for basically having, similar to Injinga, having stalled the Roman advance and prevented the Roman incursion into Nubia. She battles against the Romans for years, and actually at a point, it's almost like a war of attrition, and they basically feel that it's not worth pursuing this any further. So they actually sue for peace, and Amanirenas organizes for ambassadors to negotiate directly with Octavian, now known as Augustus on the island of Samos, where he's on holiday. And she actually doesn't end up going herself. She just says, I'll leave it up to my ambassadors. And the Romans agree, for example, when they'd conquered northern Kush, they'd imposed taxes, for example, on them, and they agreed to push back, and then they're given only a sliver of that northern territory, which is agreed to act as a buffer zone between them and the Nubians. But then they agreed to remove the taxes, and and they also they agreed to recognize Nubian sovereignty. And the Greek historian Strabo basically concludes that the Nubians obtained all that they wanted from the Romans after this conflict, because they had just so successfully stalled their advance and made it difficult for them to go further into Africa as well.
That's fascinating. My gosh.
And then the third is one about whom I haven't written in one book, but know a few details about, because she's she's a Shanti. I'm a Shanti. My husband is being a Kuru. I'm a Shanti myself, and her name is Ya Santiwa, and she's a lot later. It's going to have a span. We have like the ancient Queen Amanirenas, early modern, which is Injinga, and then sort of modern, which is
what does Shanti mean?
So Ashanti, that's a good question. Exactly what Shanti, but Ashanti is just the name of the people who. Okay. It's the name of the people. It's the name of the people basically who inhabit what's now Ghana. Because Ya Santiwa is best known for fighting at the turn of the 19th century, best known for fighting against the British in what's known as the War of the Golden Stool, which is essentially when the British were trying to conquer the Ashanti Empire. Most of the male chiefs and kings had kind of resigned themselves to trying to make peace with the British or reach some kind of agreement. And Ya Santiwa steadfastly refused in any way, shape, or form to do so, and actually led her people. And she was elderly by this point, actually in her 70s, but she led the Ashanti people against the British in these conflicts. So it's kind of remembered as this steadfast, again, warrior woman, warrior queen who refused to bow to external pressure, and actually sort of acted as the last line. And this is what I find quite fascinating. I think about a lot of the female figures who are kind of very well remembered in African history is that they're always remembered as sort of being the final line of defense in maintaining the integrity and sovereignty of their kingdom against or from external pressures. So in Injinga's case, it's the Portuguese. In Amanirenas' case, it's the Romans. And then in Santawa's case, it's the British. So that's something also that connects them.
Yeah.
There's cases in Nigeria and in North Africa, and again, it all comes. I think it's interesting. I think the ones who I find it quite interesting. The ones who always remembered actually are the warrior queens, especially in the African context as well, because I think women filled so many roles and so many important roles, even outside of warfare, when it came to governance, law and order, justice, customs, and ceremonies. But the individual figures who are remembered are often those who had this kind of, well, they not necessarily a martial element in the sense that they were warmongering at all, but they were the ones who, when push came to shove, would stand strong in the face of external military pressures. So I found that quite fascinating, and that seems to really be a theme amongst the female figures who are sort of remembered. And it's kind of the opposite to, I would say, to the male figures, because a lot of the male figures who are remembered for the most part in African history, especially in the ancient medieval, are usually the founders. So like I mentioned, there's obviously Tutu, he's the founder of the Asante Empire. There's Sundiata Keita, who's sort of who's this late 12th, early 13th century. But the female figures are remembered as the protectors and as the people who hold the line, whereas the male figures are kind of remembered as the people who kind of started and originated the things, at least as far as individuals are concerned.
Yeah, that's so insightful. Thank you so much, Luke.
Thank you ever so much. And I think it has kind of nicely come full circle, because you started, Luke, by talking about how you wrote a lot of broad themes, and then specific figures would kind of pop out who exemplified those themes. And that's exactly what you've ended on. You've talked about these themes of femininity or of masculinity, and how these specific characters came out of those tales and are remembered through history for delivering those qualities. He knows what he's doing, doesn't he?
You've spoiled us, Luke.
Yeah, an embarrassment of riches. Thank you ever so much.
Because well, given more time, I would have loved to go into more of the Injinga story in particular. I spoke sort of the broad strokes of Santawa.
You can always come back, if you want to do
we'll come back.
Hearing another visit. Yeah.
Give us a quick little synopsis of your book.
So my book, Motherland, A Journey Through 500,000 Years of African Culture and Identity, explores, as the subtitle mentions, 500,000 years of African history. And it makes the point that there's so much African history we don't know, and we don't cover beyond, especially the last 300 years. But it's split into 10 thematic chapters, each of which covers a different theme and a different aspect relating to African identity. So these include ancestral veneration, migration and multiculturalism, oral literature, and depending on the theme, I explore a different part of Africa at a different time. So for trade and migration, I look at the medieval Swahili coast and the East Africans and their trade across the Indian Ocean with Yemen, India, and China. For oral literature, I look at the hereditary storytellers of Mali, and Niger and Senegal. And then I also look at riddling and word games across the continent from the Akan and West Africa. And, I move around and just try and give people a sense of the richness, depth and sophistication of the African past.
Which is exactly what you did today. Thank you so much. What's the best place to buy your book?
I'd say online on Waterstones is great.
We can link them in the show notes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Luke.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much both for having me. I had a wonderful time.
Hey, and we'll see you soon.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of She Changed History. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and comment below. Find us on our socials, Facebook, Instagram and YouTube. If you've got any ideas of women you'd like us to cover in a future episode, please comment on the socials or email us at shechangedhistory@gmail.com. Catch you next time.